Hello, this is Mike from Dark Days Radio, and joining me is David. You're listening to A Secret Frequency on Divination. Tonight you will be regaled with stories, facts, and lore about divination, and treated to a plethora of ideas for your horror games. And special thanks to David for coming up with this. And we'll get into that in a second. This episode is going to include content dealing with real-world cultures and beliefs. So we're going to focus on how to use these ideas in a meaningful and respectful manner, not just for cheap thrills. And David, you are, of course, the one of the main writers on An Eye to the Void, which is a new source book on Kickstarter, which is system agnostic and meant to be used for divination in role-playing games. Do you want to give everyone just like a quick 30-second rundown on that?
Yeah. Cool. Hello, everyone. I've not been here for a while, but it's nice to be back. But yeah, I have written a book called Eye to the Void. It is a system agnostic book for using real-world historical folklore and religious ideas of divination and how we can use them to inspire our tabletop RPGs. So, as we say, it's a system agnostic book. It's not got mechanics, like hardcore mechanics in it. It's like, how can we use these to build really interesting stories? And how can we take the ideas from real world and bring them into our RPGs? And then run with these ideas and use them as inspiration without actually doing what some of the games have done in the past with certain cultures and beliefs, and treat them respectfully. But yeah, it's currently live on Kickstarter. It's doing quite well, and we've got some cool things coming up in the next couple of stretch goals. So that remains to be seen yet. We'll have to do a little bit more divination for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can check out the Kickstarter. And the way we're going to be treating this episode is a little bit different than a standard Secret Frequency. It's going to be kind of a mix between a Secret Frequency and just kind of a standard Darker Days episode, wherein David's going to talk about the real-world ideas behind different divination techniques. And then I'll follow it up with some examples of how this has appeared in tabletop RPGs in the past, and also just some ideas for how you can portray it in different RPGs. So this is going to be different than An Eye to the Void, wherein that one has a lot more ideas for scenes and general tips for storytellers for how to use these in games, as opposed to my wackadoodle ideas here, where I've actually got some ideas for actual mechanics for some of them, which are totally unplay tested. I just came up with them this morning, but they could be pretty fun and something to trigger some ideas for your own games.
Yep, that's what the book's for. That's what it's there for. It's there to trigger the ideas that you can run with. So,
absolutely. So, David, do you want to start off with tarot first?
Yeah. So tarot. Everyone knows what tarot is. They've heard the name. Everyone knows it. It's a deck of cards that can be used to talk about your past, your present, and your future, depending upon the way the cards are drawn. So we all know what tarot is, but within Eye to the Void, we kind of talk about a little bit of the history of it, briefly. So tarot is what is known as a form of cartomancy. Cartomancy is a divination technique using cards, using playing cards. And so tarot is obviously the most famous one, and it comes from actual playing cards. And back in the days when it was invented, it was in a way a kind of game. So it comes from Italy in the mid 15th century, so around 1440, 1450-ish is when it is born in Italy. And it's a deck of 78 cards nowadays, and there are kind of a couple of different decks that are used. So the most commonly used ones, you get 78 cards where you have the Major Arcana, which are 22 cards, which are named and numbered. You have the things like the Fool, the Hanged Man, Death, etc., etc. So commonly known names of these things, and they all have specific meanings. And if you just play with the Major Arcana and you draw 3 cards, you get your past, present, and future draw. So you'll get the Fool coming out and saying this, your past was a little bit like this. Then you'll get your present, maybe you'll draw Death, and that'll be change. And then maybe you'll draw the Hanged Man, and well, then you're a bit fucked. And that's one part of it. The rest of the cards, the rest of the 56 cards are your minor arcana. These are your 56 cards that you get from a normal playing deck. These are broken down into 4 suits, which are sometimes related to elements, sometimes are not related to elements, and there's a whole plethora of things about that. But again, each card represents a specific meaning. You get like the 10 of clubs or the 10 of swords and things like that. So that's the basic makeup of a tarot deck.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that compared to a regular playing card deck that everyone's familiar with, the court cards, you have basically the king, the queen, the knight, and then there's also the page. So there's an extra one of those face cards in there as well for the minor arcana.
Yeah, there is. But it also kind of depends on which deck you look at as to kind of how it's built.
Sure.
So there are 3 main tarot decks that use 78 cards. So the original tarot deck, which is the Tarot de Marseille, which is the Marseille deck. It comes from Marseille, France, from about the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. And that's where we get a lot of these names from. But also they all kind of change and morph throughout history as other cultures and other beliefs kind of get attached to it. And then within the late 19th century, we get I forget the name of it specifically. We were doing something on this a couple of days ago.
Are you talking about are you thinking of the Rider-Waite deck? That's really a famous one.
That's the one, the Rider-Waite deck, yes. Yeah. That's kind of like the main deck that exists now.
Right.
They come from that, and that's where we get our 78 cards from there. We also then have the Oracle decks. These are not technically tarot decks in that traditional sense, and they have a different number of cards, and they can kind of have any images upon them, but they are very much a form of cartomancy where you have cards that have very specific meanings on them. But the Thoth deck is probably the most recent development that is widely used, and it has kind of connections to numerology and the Kabbalah, whereas the Rider-Waite deck and the Tarot de Marseille are a little bit more esoteric in their related to Christian ideas, I suppose, is the way to talk about it. But yeah, so it's what everybody knows. It's a thing that everybody knows. It's been used for hundreds of years, and it's worked its way into modern culture in all manner of ways. So that's kind of what tarot is, I suppose. You've got your 3-card draw, which is the most famous one, and then there are different methods depending upon what you're trying to do. Like the Thoth deck, I know I've got one sat next to me. It has quite a few different and more complex ways of drawing cards and laying them out, so it depends on whether the card is face up, face down, whether I suppose the head of whatever it is being shown is at the top or the bottom, in what orientation it lies next to other cards and things. So you get this kind of grand scheme of how the cards lay together to what is actually being told to you through these cards. And that's it. That's kind of it. It was originally built as a game, I suppose, and it kind of went through a very large, rapid increase in popularity during the 19th century, and is now quite popular. And I think it's kind of gone past the whole connection to paganism and is now kind of just part of popular culture.
Yeah, absolutely. You see it around quite a bit. So let's talk about the tarot deck used in tabletop RPGs, because there's many games that use decks just like this. Pretty famously, Warhammer 40,000 has the Emperor's tarot deck, which is originally featured in the old Draco trilogy by Ian Watson, but it started to show up elsewhere, like the Dark Heresy RPG books. And supposedly the cards in this are linked to the corpse emperor back on Terra on his golden throne, and he influences the readings, particularly when performed by a sanctioned psyker. So that's a cool little piece of lore, and actually a great character concept that you could use.
The cards themselves are within 40k and the modern setting. They are psychoactive cards, so they are very, very much connected to the person dealing with them. And we do see them now, like one of the first episodes within Hammer and what is it? The TV
Hammer and Bolter.
Hammer and Bolter. In one of the first episodes, there's an Inquisitor who goes off and meets people, and each time he gets a dealing of the Empress Tarot, you see the cards, and they're quite visual and 3D. Games Workshop have just released something, I think yesterday, arcs and something. I can't remember, on community content where it was something to do with the Empress Tarot. So it's quite a really nice, cool thing that they've done. But then, as I was talking with Terry a couple of days ago from the Mage podcast, there's the opposite side of the Empress Tarot, the anti-tarot, the anti-Empress Tarot, which is don't mess with that, because you'll end up in the warp and your head will melt.
Yeah, definitely a danger in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. In addition to that, there's other games that have tarot decks made for them. For example, Mage the Awakening and Mage the Ascension feature physical tarot deck products as well. Mage the Awakening goes even further because it details an entire source book, Keys to the Supernal Tarot, which has explanations for how that tarot can be used in games, how it can be interpreted, and just a lot of influence for how you could use that deck in Mage the Awakening. Mm-hmm. And, much like the Emperor's tarot that we just talked about, this deck varies with its own major arcana, which are different than, say, the Rider-Waite deck that we were talking about before.
Yeah, Mage is like a brilliant game to use it in, because it has all those connections to I suppose real world magic in a way. Because it's that World of Darkness setting, or the Chronicles of Darkness setting, it connects to our real world. So it was quite easy to bring in the tarot and the ideas from it into Mage.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dungeons & Dragons Ravenloft campaign setting has its own tarot deck, which is the Taroka, originally used by the Vistani, but clearly it's been expanded in the 5th edition setting as well. And we'll talk about the Taroka later on when we get into game mechanics and the like. And I see, David, here that you highlighted another game that has a tarot deck created for it.
Yeah, so there's a couple of other games that exist that specifically use tarot. So obviously we've got this being Dark Age Radio. We like horror. There's Cult. Divinity Lost has, I think it's a 56 deck of cards, which they call a tarot deck, and it's used it's not a specific tarot deck, but it's a deck of cards that you can use to kind of help throw out locations and effects that can go on during the game. That looks quite cool, that I need to kind of have a look at more. And then there are 2 games that I'm aware of that specifically use traditional tarot decks as a mechanic within the way the game is played. I don't know much about them. I do need to look into them a little bit more, but we've got something called Divination RPG, where the tarot deck is the key mechanic into how the game is played. And then there's another kind of really cute little game that's just come up onto Kickstarter called Codico, A Magical Year. Again, the tarot deck is the core mechanic. Rather than using dice, it uses a tarot deck. And there are other games out there which use like cards and things rather than the dice mechanics and stuff. So
back in the early 2000s, there was the Engel RPG, which White Wolf actually translated from German, but they only carried over one of the core game mechanics, which was the D20 system. But in the German version, it supposedly has a game mechanics where you use tarot cards for it, which is very cool. I think the German version is available on DriveThruRPG as a PDF, so maybe I'll buy it sometime and try to translate it. See if I can figure out what those game mechanics are.
I should probably try and learn some German living here and attempt to do that myself. Don't think I'm going to be here long enough to get that level of German, but we'll see.
Indeed. Yeah, and then Shadowrun had its own tarot deck and a book associated, which was the Book of the Lost, I think. I actually have a copy, but I haven't read it. But that's just another neat little thing for cyberpunk gaming, fantasy cyberpunk gaming. Yeah. But let's talk about game mechanics a little bit and dive into this. So The tarot is a really interesting and spicy way to randomize your games and provide some really dramatic scenes. So most famously, with card randomization, there was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons I6 Castle Ravenloft module, which at one point has the characters meet a fortune teller who tells them their fate in the adventure, drawing cards to represent events, backstory, and item locations relevant to that game. The original module recommends just using plain playing cards, but later versions allow for the Taroka deck, just that kind of custom Ravenloft one. Or, if you really wanted to, you can even use tarot cards themselves for the drawing, which is actually what I did when I ran Castle Ravenloft, 5 years ago or something. Although, humorously, during that really dramatic, tense scene, spooky scene, one of my roommates walked in to make some toast, so that kind of ruined the mood. But for your own games, this kind of card randomization can provide really great inspiration during a fortune-telling scene. So rather than writing out what every card does, pick 3 to 4 key events that tarot cards should represent. So for example, maybe you want to determine potential allies for the players. So you randomly draw from the deck of Major Arcana and Court cards from each suit. You could probably leave the Minor Arcana, just 1 through 10 of Cups, off to the side for this one. And when drawing the Fool, the Empress, or King of Cups, that's a pretty straightforward and easy inspiration for the future. While cards like the Wheel of Fortune or the Hanged Man might, kind of seed some dire scenes into the future. And these are ideas that you could play with and work with in the game. Alternatively, there are just a lot of books out there that explain the meaning of individual tarot cards and what the art on them represents. So maybe during a one-shot game, you could agree to all draw a tarot card for each character at the beginning, and this could dictate maybe their past fate, or future fate, or their personality, for example, as a way to just kind of bring some extra influence in from the tarot deck, and just have a fun randomization of what the character might be like, just to change it every time.
Yeah, that's a really good, that whole randomization, of just this is for this scene, maybe this is something that your character is drawn to or is concentrated upon. One of the possible stretch goals that we are talking about at the moment is an actual specific tool for using a traditional tarot deck within your RPGs, and we're kind of throwing around ideas as to kind of what we should do. And that's actually a really, really nice, interesting way to think about it. It's rather than actually using it as a specific divination idea, go, yes, I've drawn this card, so therefore this is the meaning and this is what the divination is you walk into the room, the diviner looks at you, and you suddenly see this card has been drawn for you, and you start to feel the effects of that card upon yourself. It's not an actual true divination in the way that this is what's going to happen in your life, and this is the story that the game is going to take, but maybe for the next few scenes you have this overbearing feeling of whatever the card was showing you.
Yeah, it's a great idea. So David, we kind of eased people in with tarot decks. People are really familiar with them from movies, TV, all that kind of stuff, fiction.
Yeah.
Now let's go for a really zesty one. Let's talk about geomancy. Take it away.
Geomancy is not throwing stones at people.
Good to know. Good to know. You should tell the people that made Final Fantasy Tactics that.
Or just anything that thinks it needs to use an earth-based magic. Everyone goes, oh, it's geomancy. It's yeah, geomancy. Yeah, let's just throw rocks at people. Yeah, that's not what geomancy is. So there was this concept. Before I get into kind of what geomancy is, let's talk about a little bit of darkness. In the 16th, 17th century, I've probably got the dates slightly wrong here. It might be slightly earlier, it might be slightly later. There was what is known as the 7 forbidden arts that the church were yeah, no, these are really bad. You shouldn't mess with these. Geomancy was one of them. And it sat alongside hydromancy, so water divination, aeromancy, air divination, pyromancy, fire divination, chiromancy, which we now call palmistry, and scapulomancy, which is I'm not going to tell you what that is. If you want to know what that is, go back to the Kickstarter, because we go into detail on what that is. And then the last one is necromancy, and I think we're going to talk about necromancy later, so I won't go into what that is. Geomancy is one of these forbidden arts, and it is divination through using the earth. So there are multiple different ways that this can happen, but the most common one, and it's kind of having a little bit of a revival, it had like tarot had a bit of a revival in the 19th century. We can thank the Victorians for this. They had a massive increase in interest in folklore and old stories and things, and Victorian folklorists did actually some good work of re-inspiring people to look at these things. So, but geomancy as an art, the more specific idea that what it is something related to squares and shapes and geomantic patterns, and how they work is kind of complicated and kind of long-winded. Yeah. But basically you kind of enter into a ritual state and you randomly draw squares, and then you randomly put 16 dots within these squares, and the position of the squares and the position of the dots within the squares represents certain levels and certain ideas, kind of in the way like you get with a tarot deck, where you've got your different suits and you've got your different connections between the suits and the numbers and the different, those kind of ideas. You have the same thing within the squares. You've got the mother, you've got the daughter, there's a judge, and there's different levels of kind of how these things connect to each other depending upon the number of dots within them. And these geomantic squares are quite interesting patterns when you actually look at them. So it's quite in a way, it's kind of a mathematical, weird form of divination. And that's when you talk to people who do divination, that's what, when you say geomancy, that's what they think of. There is also many forms within geomancy that are not that. So there's casting of earth, there's casting of salt, there's looking at cracks within rocks and the patterns within those. If we go over to Asia, you can the I Ching and Feng Shui are also considered forms of geomancy because they relate to patterns within nature. So in a way, you can kind of consider geomancy along with these geomantic squares. They are the geomantic squares are generally drawn within dirt and dust or sand and things. It is patterns seen within rocks and within, I want to say nature, but it's not nature. It's kind of like that more physical rock, solid, sand, dirt kind of idea, not just plants and stuff. Plants and things are something else. So that's what geomancy really is. And yeah, it's quite a large topic.
It is, and it really made my head spin trying to research it for this.
Oh god, like when I was writing the little bit that we've got in the book, I was like, okay, I need to describe what geomancy is and geomantic squares are. How am I going to put a 7-page description of these things into like 1.5 paragraphs? It's insane.
You need a lot of figures, I think, and that's why it's going to be very hard for us to discuss this. In the context of an audio podcast, but we're going to try our best. So, examples in tabletop RPGs of geomancy, none that I know of, none that are accurate to.
None that scream out at me. No.
Yeah, there's a lot of throwing rocks at people, but not actual real geomancy. So, how are you going to use this mechanically in a game? I got some ideas here. So, I think the easiest thing to gamify about this would be the geomantic squares or geomantic figures. And typically you're going to have, I've seen some images, and there's all different shapes, all different ways that these can be set up, but I've seen some that are quite simple. They're basically a 4 square by 4 square structure, right? It's a square that's broken up basically into 16 individual square elements. And those can have like individual numberings associated with them. So I was thinking, all right, we have 16 numbers, 16 squares, 16 numbers. Well, there's a lot of RPGs out there that revolve around a 20-sided die. 5th edition, Palladium, that new Monty Python game. So you could have...
I shouldn't laugh at that.
No, it's all right. It was meant to be a joke.
I know.
The game is a joke. So you could have a character who reads geomantic patterns to gain story and setting insight, or to provide additional abilities. So in the context of this D20 system, the character might have a separate 4 square by 4 square sheet, kind of like a bingo board, essentially, with numbers, let's say 4 through 19 filled in. So when a character rolls a number on the sheet with their D20, they could mark it off, right? So they could, let's say you rolled an 11, you can mark off that 11 square on your sheet. And when certain patterns emerge that match one of the 16 geomantic figures that exist. There's actual specific patterns. One looks like a Y, another's an inverse Y. You've got just a straight line. You've got double straight lines, and some other kind of. There's one that's kind of like sh in Cyrillic that I saw. So there's a bunch of different patterns, and when you get your essentially bingo board to match that, you can then use an effect, clear that board, use an effect associated with that particular geomantic shape, and basically activate it. And this can be something where the dungeon master or storyteller has to tell you the truth. It could be a truth that you create through your own player agency, right? You're declaring some sort of fate to the game. Or maybe it could be something as simple as just like spell bonuses, that sort of thing, for the more combat-focused games.
That's really cool, because that brings in then not just the idea of the geomantic squares, but you can also then bring in ideas of numerology. And if you fill in that square in specific way, it like randomizes the numbers within that, and then you manage to make that geomantic shape or figure, and you're connecting the correct numbers that relate to maybe a specific god within the world that you're playing in, you then get extra bonuses. Or if you kind of slightly naff it up a little bit and you've connected the wrong numbers together in the wrong shape, you end up connecting to maybe not the correct god, but you don't know that, and something bad happens. So you can kind of bring in some really fun ideas with numerology as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to make this a little bit zestier, because the way they had this kind of written up, it's really just bonuses. It's just extra abilities, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
In the context of a D20 system, what if each number that you filled in could not be a success anymore? You rolled that 11, you put it on your sheet. Now, anytime you roll an 11, it's a failure, even if it would normally be some sort of a success. So that kind of ups the ante for your character, and you don't want to just fill out a sheet completely. Now, of course, when you clear the board and get one of those bonus effects, you get all of your die results back at that point. But I think that might be a good way to kind of balance things out.
It also builds up that kind of the tension of you reaching the climax of the power of either the divination or the magic that you're trying to do with this, because you're almost there, but the risk of getting that final number is exponential, because you've now got you have to hit that specific number, because if you hit something else, things are going to go wrong. I like that. That's certainly up, as you say, ups the ante a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in the context of, say, the World of Darkness, which is a dice pool game, this is a bit tougher to do, right? Your dice, you have a limited dice pool. It might only go to, let's say, it goes from 1 to 10 on a single die. But I actually just had an idea as you were talking, and dice trays are very popular. And what is geomancy in some cases but throwing rocks to see what the pattern is? So let's put this bingo board.
Not just geomancy, but any form of casting, like casting the runes and casting of lots and things like that. Yeah,
indeed. So let's just throw a dice into a dice tray, which has that kind of bingo board inside of it. And if it comes out that your dice form a particular geomantic shape, boom, extra effect that could occur. And in the context of a dice pool game, that's not going to be very common, right? You have the randomness of how you roll, but in addition to that, some of these shapes require at least 4 dice. Others require 8, like the double 2 lines of 4.
Yeah.
So that would be very, very uncommon to have, and would require at least a dice pool of 8. So I think that would be a very interesting way to spice things up, although I am, of course, afraid that it could slow the game down as everyone's looking like, does this match one of the shapes? So it could be interesting, could use some playtesting, but that's another way that you could use
It's definitely an
geomancy.
interesting idea. Because we do also do a lot. We do talk in the book about casting and stuff, and the shapes and how they fall, how the pieces that you are using in the casting fall, and this brings in an actual physical mechanic to it. So if you have a geomantic board of numbers laid out, or some other kind of board that has shapes on it, so you can look at spirit boards or something. You can even create your own thing. As the DM or the GM or the storyteller, you have a lot of control over it. So if you roll, if the dice are rolled and it forms a pattern on there, the storyteller can go, yes, I can see this shape within it, so therefore this is the story that is being told from what you've cast. Then kind of removes the idea of like, does this actually match or not? Let the storyteller kind of play with the story of it rather than is this specific. If you design a system that is very, very specific and it has to match all those sets very, very clearly, yeah, I can see how you can kind of end up in those arguments. But give the power to the story rather than to the specifics of the pattern, I think.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Great advice. All right, David, should we move on to the next topic?
Yes, the next topic, I think we can put a little bit of a content trigger warning onto it. Animals. We're going to talk about 2 specific parts of animal divination here. And this is animal sacrifice. So if you're a little bit squeamish and don't particularly like hurting animals, probably this is not the best part for you. And we do put comments in the book that we've written about please check these things. But so animal sacrifice is, or was I should say, a form of divination that was quite popular in ancient times in Mesopotamia, and some of the oldest forms that we know of come from Babylonia and Mesopotamia, and like 2,500 years ago, 2,500 BCE, there are reports and knowledge of animal sacrifice being used as divination. That far ago, so 5,000 years ago, we know that this happened. And it has a name called Horospex, unsure of the actual pronunciation, but it's basically you sacrifice an animal and then you use its entrails and its guts to predict the future. You get I'm trying to think of words here now. My brain's gone blank. You get ideas from the heart and the liver and the conditions of them, whether they're fresh and clean and still beating, that shows a good omen. If they're rotten and twisted and torn up, that's a bad omen. Within Roman and Greek times, so the ancient Roman, ancient Greece cultures, they would quite regularly sacrifice animals before a battle to know whether the gods were favouring them. But there was a point that within Roman society where the sacrifice of animals was not always seen as a strong enough connection to the divine to give you a good answer. So they developed what we call anthropomancy, and they went to the next level of animal sacrifice. They started to sacrifice humans, and they used human sacrifice as a form of divination. We also see this within Mesoamerica. The Aztecs and the Incas did do a form of this as well, where you would sacrifice either willing victims or criminals and use their organs to speak to the gods and find out either the futures or whether the gods were smiling kindly on the choices that you were making. So, yes, lots of blood and guts, basically.
Indeed, yeah. And how to use this safely in games? Dave, you just mentioned, checking with players about if harm to animals is a trigger, before the game or before the session, for example. That could be a good way to avoid anything.
I do like the next one you've written here. I do like this.
Indeed. I would not recommend using real entrails in your game. If you need a real physical prop for a game, maybe just use spaghetti and tomato sauce. Thick spaghetti. It'll probably work.
Yeah, we do not support anyone going out at all and finding their own animals and performing this for real. That's not a good thing. Please don't do that.
Indeed. I mean, someone who is really dedicated could go to a butcher and get a prop, but your players might not like that.
Yeah.
Let's not do that.
Yeah.
So, how to use this in games? This is a challenging one to gamify. Our good friend Chris really likes the Cult of Mithras in his vampire Manchester setting, and we do too. Yep. So horospecs and anthropomancy are pretty good for portraying that cult itself. As mentioned, Mithras was a deity that Romans, for example, worshipped. There
was even within the traditional idea of Mithras, you've got the weird bowl that they'd put people inside, and you can kind of connect that, I suppose. But anyway, carry on. Sorry, sidetrack.
Yes, no. There's a lot of interesting stuff with Mithras and Mithraic cults, and of course, there is evidence that some of the Roman soldiers did bring their practices up to the British Isles when they were there.
There is. So, I discovered. This talking about Mithras. This is quite interesting. I discovered that there is a Mithras temple in the town that I now live in Germany, in Heidelberg. There's an actual temple to Mithras here, which I didn't know until a couple of weeks ago.
David, if you keep showing up to places with the remnants of Mithraic cults, I think we're going to start getting a little worried here.
I didn't do anything. I've not lived in two places that have Mithraic cults in them at all. It's got nothing to do with me. I don't know what you're talking about.
At least two. All right, but anyway, so we're talking about vampire and animal sacrifice or the sacrifice of living beings. So in a more sandbox vampire game, each night of the game could start with a scene of sacrifice. So the cult would gather around the Mithraeum and play out the sacrifice itself. And roles, actions, and of course the victim's randomly determined blood resonance in Vampire 5th Edition could determine some of the events for the night. So, gamifying that, I would prefer to keep it random as to what the resonance of the victim is, but potentially, yes, someone could go out and sample and kind of get a feel for the resonance and say, oh, this would be good to enhance our social ploys for the next night, for example, if you wanted to do it that way. Human sacrifice, of course, would come up a lot in games like Demon of the Fallen, Cult, Dark Ages Fae, and maybe a Hunter the Vigil game focused on slashers quite a bit. I think Dark Ages Fae would be particularly interesting because, as written, it's the only way that the Fae really interact with humans is through contracts and pacts with the otherworldly Fae. Adding in this additional human sacrifice, you probably have to add some sort of a mechanic if your players are okay with it. Or this could be for a more dreadful, say, winter Fae in that setting. That could add another reason for the Fae to leave the mists and interact with humans, which is something that is sorely needed in that game, in my opinion.
There's also, obviously, the obvious connection with Warhammer 40,000, where thousands of psychers are sacrificed every day to the God Emperor of mankind. So you're seeing human sacrifice on a galactic scale there. But you've also got the rights of Tzeentch, who would quite happily sacrifice people to weave the ways of fate, so he can create his multiple paths of the future. So there's that. I think you've got quite strong connections with animal and human sacrifice within Warhammer 40k. You can obviously then translate that into Age of Sigmar and fantasy as well with Tzeentch and things. So
yeah, Tzeentch, that's an interesting one, Dave, that you just brought up, because as the Changer of Ways, it's usually his schemes that are being enacted. He's not physically going out, and nor are his cultists, like, let's say, hacking a person apart. So it would have to come down to their schemes to indirectly sacrifice someone, which I think could be an interesting basis for an antagonist.
Yeah, creating some kind of weird backstory where the leader of the town needs to be sacrificed in a specific way for a certain weave of fate that the Changer of Ways wants to happen, but it can only happen because if this person is sacrificed in a specific way, but they obviously can't get involved with it, so they need to create the town in that kind of way. And you get all that kind of background politics and weirdness that you end up with Tzeentch. You've got the obvious idea with Khorne that, sacrifice, blood god, chop people's heads off, skulls for the skull throne and all that kind of stuff as well, on a more less subtle way, I suppose. Yeah, certainly the Warhammer universes have a lot that you can play with in that. So
definitely. And of course, animal sacrifice could be a great theme in a fantasy role-playing game that has many fantastical creatures such as RuneQuest, Talislanta, Dungeons and Dragons, of course, but even Mage the Ascension with the Bygone Bestiary. So Divination may require that the characters hunt down rare and obscure creatures, and this could allow you to highlight some of the less seen fauna of those settings, or take the character or characters to a really off the beaten path, to a place they wouldn't normally go. And this divination might require some butchering or possibly ingesting parts of the beast as part of a vision quest.
Within the worlds that we play in, like especially within fantasy settings, there are so many different creatures that exist within these. That do they all have specific connections to divine powers, and do they need to be treated in a specific way? So we see within just normal divination that specific animals have specific connections to the ways that work. So you've got the white stag is very much a Christian image of goodness, and this is where things should lead, and that crosses over to Asian culture, where the white stag is one of the founding stories of Japan. But then you've got the opposite, where you've got a black stag, and there was a black stag shot by the police in the UK a couple of years ago, and then when we ended up in where the world is now. So you can draw connections if you want to. So depending on the type of animal that is, and if you're in a fantasy world, there's so many different animals that you can bring in, and doing them in different way, treating them in different ways, and eating different parts of them, or doing different things. You can have a lot of fun exploring these ideas.
Yeah, indeed, and that's a good point, that you could also kind of take this the opposite direction, where your characters may be trying to preserve certain fauna and preventing their sacrifice. So that could be really interesting.
Yep, definitely. So one of the things we've got going on to a few honourable mentions in a minute, but one of the things that we've tried to do with the book is, because it is obviously we've got a limited space within the book, and we've tried to cover as many things as we can. We've not given specific, like we've just talked about here, like specific mechanics. We've talked about ways that you can kind of grow the worlds themselves and use these divination ideas to kind of add depth to the storytelling. But adding all these little things in that we've talked about here is just adds icing to the top of the cake, I suppose. It creates these wonderful, deep ideas. And yeah, we go into a lot more detail in other things, and there's a lot of other parts of animal divination that is not murdering animals. So it's been quite good fun looking into it. Let's talk about some honourable mentions that we can't really go into detail on.
Yeah, sure. So the book does talk about runes, and since we talked about tarot decks, didn't think we really need to talk about casting too much. But one interesting thing that you brought up in there was just like, you can make up your own runic alphabet if you want to use that. Great idea. And it actually got me thinking that the D&D 5th edition Player's Handbook actually has the Dwarven runic alphabet in it, which is would be very easy to just port over and use. You can just make some little tokens, like some MDF tokens or something, paint on the little symbols, and boom, there you go. You can kind of create your own system with that.
Very much so. You can, if you really want to get involved, go out, get a branch, cut the branch up into a couple of little circles, and paint it onto some wood. Within runic divination, the type of wood that you carve the runes in is quite important. Even though runes technically is an alphabet and it was used as a form of portraying a message, it is also connected to magic. So if you carve it onto the stone, the type of stone you do it onto, the type of wood you do it onto, you can bring all these wonderful ideas into your own game. So you're like, oh yes, I've got this bag of oak wood dwarven runes, or these obsidian dwarven runes where the dwarves have gone down deep below the earth, and they've hacked out these from this really small vein of obsidian that was existing in this hard rock that took many centuries to mine, and kind of going that kind of idea of creating this actual alphabet for them to use as divinations, adding that kind of extra layer behind them. Yeah, we just went out and got some rock and carved into the alphabets to it.
Yeah, definitely a good idea. Definitely cool. And David, I know you really want to talk about the next one, so I think I'm done with my honorable mentions. And let me get out the soapbox here and let you stand on it.
Dead people. I see dead people. Yeah, so necromancy. It's the fun and games that is necromancy. So in what most people think of necromancy is all those memes that you see out there. I'm going to bring my axe. I'm going to bring my sword. Necromancer comes up. I'm going to bring your brother. It's raising the dead. Is what you see in most games as to what necromancy is. That in divination is a very small part of what necromancy is. Necromancy is actually summoning spirits or entities for a bit of a bedside chat, really. I've now got this image of just people sat around a table with a cup of tea talking to a spirit. But yeah, it's summoning of entities to talk to, and they have connections to the other world and can kind of tell you your future, your past, your present, paths that you may or may not want to go down. So you can bring this in in your games as who are you summoning? What creature, what entity are you summoning? Is it one of your ancestors? So in something like vampire, are you going to try and summon some of those vampires from hundreds of years ago that may have fought in wars and were before? My mind's gone blank. What happened in Prague? What was the thing that happened in Prague?
Not familiar. In the context of Prague, I'm not sure. I mean, we have the fall of London. We've got the craziness in Berlin that happened in V5.
Oh, okay. If we're going to stick in V5, yeah. So if you just go my brain is just kind of completely melted on ideas now. But if you're in Vampire, you can go back and you can summon maybe old vampires who have died, or you can do, to some extent, you maybe want to wake them from torpor. That could be considered a form of necromancy, where they have, because they're such low generation vampires, they've been around for so long that they actually have this connection. You can kind of talk to them and go, well, they did this, so we might be able to do this. Obviously, you've got any connection to Chronicles of Darkness, any of those games, Wrath, you can bring it into as to bringing the spirits across between the realms. 40k, Wrath and Glory, Age of Sigmar, talking to the gods. So necromancy, the entities that you speak to could be you are summoning the gods. Do you want to summon Nagash? Is that a really wise idea? And things like that. So it's kind of like summoning entities to have a bit of a chat to. I don't want to go into too much detail because I go into quite a lot of detail in the book on it. So.
Understood, yeah. But just something to bring up. That was definitely interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing when you realise that it's not just summoning the dead. You can have a lot more fun with it when you're thinking about other entities that you want to summon. Cthulhu. You could summon Cthulhu. Because that's always a fun thing to do. We've got two more things that I kind of... One I'll just say very, very quickly, and then the other thing is kind of like the overall idea of what the book is showing. So, in D&D specifically, I know that when you do something like scrying as a divination technique, it is pretty much spying. My concept is scrying is not spying. It's looking through things like mirrors and shining surfaces or pools of water and seeing the pathways and the futures through that, or actually spying on people. Yes, that is a part of it, but that's not the whole part of it. You use the ideas of scrying, looking through these mirrored surfaces of whatever the mirrored surface is, and seeing the futures evolve through that. Maybe it's a TV. Maybe you're looking through a TV on that. But the overall kind of theme that kind of ties the entire book together is that patterns, you can use any form of pattern as divination. So the way the runes fall, the actual patterns of cracks in a rock, how birds fly, the way the entrails fall out of an animal. Divination is about reading patterns. And if you can think of a pattern in the world that you're playing in, you can definitely bring out some form of divination from it. I think that's kind of like the key message, I think.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's all we've got for this episode. This has, of course, been a Secret Frequency from Darker Days Radio. You already know where to find us from all the other episodes on our social media, but more importantly, definitely want people to check out An Eye to the Void. And we're going to put a link in the show notes to that Kickstarter, which is going on right now. This episode's going to get out right after we're done recording.
It is.
So,
as a bit of self-promotion plug here, it's £5 for a PDF that is probably going to be about 130 pages long. So, have a punt.
Yeah, that's good value.
Yep. We also do physical copies as well, but they're more expensive. If you just want to kind of jump in and see what it's about, £5. We also have a free chapter. The Casting and Runes chapter is currently as a preview up on DriveThruRPG for free, so you can kind of see what we're doing with it there.
Oh, great. I'll put the link to that in the show notes as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, awesome. David, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here on the show as usual.
No worries.
And thank you to all the listeners. And until our next Secret Frequency, good night, good luck, and stay safe out there.